Roger, liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir, reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, Roger, go from
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of Space News for the week of November 20, 2019. I'm Peter Aylward, and I've Tina Stagg and Michael Abdillah with me here tonight, and we're all from the Space Association. And let's get started with some Australian space news. Applications are open for Australian space funding grants. The Australian Space Agency has opened applications for the Australian Government's new Space Grants Program, which allocates sums from $100,000 to $4 million to eligible companies and research organisations. The funding is for projects to build capability and capacity of the Australian space sector through engagement with international space agencies or their supply chains. The guidelines for the International Space Investment Expanded Capability Program were launched in October following consultations across the country. The government said the grants would support Australian businesses and research organisations to become involved with international space agencies or established international space programs. The program's objectives are to unlock international space opportunities for the Australian space sector, expand sector capability and capacity, and support job creation. Grants are only available to companies incorporated in Australia or to publicly funded research organisations. The grants program, launched in the April budget, isn't enormous. It's $15 million over 3 years. So they've allocated $3 million for the 2019-2020 year, $5 million 2021, and $7 million 21-22. Those seeking grants will need to demonstrate that a minimum of 80% of the investment will be made in Australia for the benefit of Australian space industry firms. To get your applications in, they close December 17. And across the Dutch and New Zealand, the New Zealand space economy is small, but it's growing. A report prepared by Deloitte for the New Zealand government, released last week, concluded the country's space industry contributed 1.69 billion New Zealand dollars to the country's economy last year. That industry is led by Rocket Lab, which builds and launches rockets in the country. But the report also highlighted the role many small businesses play in the overall economy. And Rocket Lab has introduced a new robotic manufacturing system to speed up production of its Electron rockets. The custom-designed system, nicknamed Rosie, can produce the carbon composite elements of the rocket, including its stages and payload fairings, in just 12 hours, a task that used to take more than 400 hours. Rosie is part of an effort by Rocket Lab to speed up production so we can carry out one launch a week, a move that also includes attempting to recover and reuse the rocket's first stage. Rocket Lab released a video on Twitter last week of company CEO Peter Beck, in which he introduced Rosie to the world. And it's over to you, Tina, for some space policy.
Thanks, Peter. And good evening, space fans. The Senate Commerce Committee approved a NASA authorisation bill last week. The committee approved the bill, introduced a week earlier, on a voice vote as part of a package including nearly 20 amendments that made minor changes to the bill. The bill's key provisions, including authorising an extension of the International Space Station to 2030, remained intact. The committee also approved a separate bill renaming NASA's Plum Brook Station in Ohio after Neil Armstrong. A House committee raised doubts about NASA's current approach to returning humans to the moon by 2024. At a hearing last week by the House Science Committee's Space Subcommittee, members of both parties questioned the agency's existing plans and noted the lack of funding for them so far. Republican members in particular argued for an approach that made greater use of the SLS instead of commercial launch vehicles, saying it would be simpler and increase the odds of mission success. The hearing's two witnesses, former astronaut Tom Stafford and retired executive Tom Young, also endorsed that alternative and argued against experiments on contracting for the program, such as the purchase of commercial services for lunar landers. And to the International Space Station. NASA has begun a series of spacewalks to repair a key scientific instrument on the station. Andrew Morgan and Luca Parmitano carried out the first in a projected series of 4 spacewalks last week to start work replacing the cooling system on the Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer, or AMS. These spacewalks are particularly challenging since the AMS was not designed to be serviced after its installation on the station in 2011, requiring NASA to work for 4 years on repair techniques, including the design of customised tools. If the cooling system is successfully replaced, AMS should continue to operate until at least 2030, collecting data on cosmic rays. To NASA and the Commercial Crew Program, a report last week by NASA's Office of Inspector General, or OIG, criticised additional payments made to Boeing for commercial crew work. The report cited the unusual technical issues Boeing and SpaceX have been experiencing with the development of their respective Starliner and Dragon spacecraft, but far more illuminating was its discussion of costs. Notably, the report published estimated seat prices for the first time and also delved into the extent Boeing has gone to in extracting more money from NASA over and above its fixed price award. The report found NASA agreed to pay Boeing an additional $287.2 million to secure additional flexibilities in scheduling future CST-100 Starliner missions, in part because of concerns of a gap in crew access, without offering similar opportunities to SpaceX. The report said the majority of the additional payment was unnecessary, since NASA could take other steps to mitigate the perceived 18-month gap in flights to the ISS anticipated during 2019. The report also argued that NASA officials felt the additional payments were necessary to ensure Boeing continued as a second provider in the Commercial Crew Program. Both NASA and Boeing defended the payments, and Boeing said it never considered withdrawing from the program. The report also published estimated seat prices for the first time: $90 million for Starliner and $55 million for Dragon, with each capsule expected to carry 4 astronauts to the space station during a typical mission. What is notable about Boeing's price is that it is also higher than what NASA has paid the Russian space corporation Roscosmos for Soyuz spacecraft seats to fly US and partner nation astronauts to the space station. Overall, NASA paid Russia an average cost per seat of $55.4 million for the 70 completed and planned missions from 2006 through to 2020, while since 2017, NASA has paid Russia an average of $79.7 million per seat. Boeing has received $4.82 billion from NASA over the lifetime of the Commercial Crew Program, compared to $3.14 billion for SpaceX. And turning to SpaceX news. SpaceX carried out a static fire test of its Crew Dragon launch abort thrusters last week. SpaceX and NASA said the test, where the vehicle's Super Draco thrusters were fired for 9 seconds, took place at Cape Canaveral. They said engineers were still evaluating data from the test. The test was a prelude to an in-flight abort test of the vehicle expected sometime next month. A similar static fire test in April resulted in an explosion that destroyed another Crew Dragon spacecraft, which SpaceX said was caused when propellant leaked into helium tubes that, when pressurised, hurled it into a titanium valve and ignited it. To NASA's planetary and space science programs, NASA's WFIRST Space Telescope passed its preliminary design review amid uncertainty about its budget. The mission completed the review at the beginning of the month, and NASA officials say development of the infrared space telescope is on track for a launch in 2025. As reported here on Space News last week, NASA's fiscal year 2020 budget included no funding for WFIRST, but both House and Senate versions of appropriation bills do fund the mission. One complication is that the lower amount of funding for WFIRST in the Senate bill could force NASA to replan the mission and potentially further delay its launch. And now over to Michael.
Thanks, Tina, and let's turn to some news from Mars. The mystery of Martian methane continues while fluctuating oxygen levels have surprised researchers. The European Space Agency said its two orbiters, Mars Express and ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter, failed to detect any methane in the Martian atmosphere, even as NASA's Curiosity rover detected its strongest burst of methane yet at the surface of the planet. Scientists think the methane burst measured by Curiosity lasted less than a day and was mixed into the atmosphere before the orbiters could pass over the site. Meanwhile, the oxygen in the Martian atmosphere is changing in a way that can't currently be explained by known chemical processes. That's the claim of scientists working on the Curiosity mission, who have been taking measurements of the gas. They discovered that the amount of oxygen rose by 30% in the Martian spring and summer. The pattern remains a mystery, but researchers are beginning to narrow the possibilities. While the changes are most likely to be geological in nature, planetary scientists can't completely rule out an explanation involving microbial life. And moving to China. China tested the lander it plans to fly to Mars next year. The test last week at a site outside Beijing demonstrated the lander's ability to avoid obstacles and land on the Martian surface. The test used a rigging system to simulate the lower gravity on Mars. China plans to fly a lander carrying a rover on a mission launching in mid-2020 that will also include a Mars orbiter. Meanwhile, in India, India's space agency ISRO is reportedly considering flying another lunar lander mission in as soon as a year. ISRO sources claim the agency is considering launching a standalone lander mission as soon as November 2020, although there are no details on how the lander could be built so quickly or how much it would cost. A report into the failed landing in September of the Vikram lander, part of the Chandrayaan-2 mission, is ready for final approval by the Indian government, with the expectation the report will then be released to the public. And in Japan, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries is considering increasing the performance of its new H3 rocket. The company said improvements to the rocket would allow it to launch heavier payloads beyond Earth orbit, such as in support of lunar exploration missions. But the enhanced H3 would not be ready before 2030 and would require launch pad improvements as well. In the interim, MHI is studying approaches for sending cargo spacecraft to the Lunar Gateway using 2 H3 launches.
Thanks, Michael. In some other commercial space news, OneWeb has delayed its first large-scale satellite launch by a month. The company said the launch of at least 30 satellites, which had been scheduled for December on a Soyuz rocket, was now planned for mid to late January. OneWeb said it delayed the launch to perform additional tests on the satellites. The company expects to deploy its initial constellation using 20 Soyuz launches, plus the first Ariane 6 launch next year. OneWeb, which cancelled all but 4 of an original 39 launches in a contract with Virgin Orbit, is seeking to dismiss a lawsuit filed by Virgin in a New York court over the contract. And finally, this week, some heart news. Human heart cells function differently in microgravity. Research performed on the International Space Station examined how human heart cells adapted to the lack of gravity. Scientists found that the cells quickly changed their beating pattern and how they recycled calcium. The cells returned to normal patterns 10 days after return to Earth. Scientists said they were surprised how quickly the heart cells adapted to the microgravity environment, which could aid research for improving astronaut health on long-duration missions. And that's it for Space News this week. Thank you, Tina and Michael, and we'll speak to you again next week. Bye now.